Thanks for tuning in to the Abiding Presence podcast with Gary Funk. You can reach Gary at theupperroomfamily@gmail.com.
Well, hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Abiding Presence podcast and to part 2 of our discussion on divorce, remarriage, and the grace of God. I'm hoping that you found part 1 helpful for you in terms of tuning your heart for what might lie ahead on this podcast journey for you. You know, today I'd like to start us off by sharing a really cool comment that I came across, interesting one anyway, that I came across by author and college professor Calvin Miller. And he said that a person would almost be better off shooting their spouse instead of divorcing them because murderers get more mercy in most churches than divorcees do. Now, I think you can see the point that he's trying to make. And if Professor Miller is right, is it possible that we as faith communities have something serious to consider here? Is it possible that we have sometimes made the mistake of thinking that all divorced people are kind of like leftovers or damaged goods? And is it possible that we have assigned them to a lower class of spirituality in our own minds and in our thinking? And even if we don't outwardly express this in obvious ways, do we still sometimes secretly harbor attitudes like that towards those who have endured the trauma of divorce? And if you've grown up in church all your life, you may already know that. I mean, every church is different, right? But in some churches, divorced people are not allowed to serve in certain areas. They're not allowed to teach Sunday school, or they're not allowed to sing on stage, or they can't serve in any type of leadership capacity whatsoever, all because they are divorced. And in many cases, the story behind their divorce is not even considered. My wife and I have a close friend who is a gifted teacher and speaker. This individual is extremely passionate about the Lord, as passionate as anyone I've ever seen. And this person lives graciously from what I would call abiding presence. And this friend has repeatedly felt the sting of rejection that comes from religious groups once they discover that divorce is part of this person's story. Now, does this seem fair to you? Would you even say that this is quote unquote biblical? And does this judgment that our friend experiences accurately reflect the heart of God towards this person? Now, if you're sitting on the fence as you process this little story, keep this in mind as this series of podcasts unfolds, okay? Now, some people might be quick to say, well, but God says in the Bible, I hate divorce. And yes, God hates divorce because of the brokenness and the pain that it causes the children that he loves. And there are actually more layers to this verse in Malachi chapter 2. And in due time, we will get back to that in this series. But while we're at it, let's talk about some of the things that God hates for a moment, shall we? In Proverbs 7, verses 16 to 19, we see more of the things that God hates. And they are listed almost as if they might be God's, top 7 sins or something like that, okay? Let's read those here. Proverbs 6, verse 16 says, there are 6 things that the Lord hates. No, 7 things that he detests. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that kill the innocent, a heart that plots evil, feet that race to do wrong, a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who sows discord in a family. Okay, now, having heard that, think of this question. If you had to choose one of these 7 actions as the worst violation on this list, which one would you pick? So we have pride, we have lying, we have murder, we have planning evil actions, we have loving to do what's wrong, we have falsely accusing someone, and we have disrupting unity among a group of people. Which one of these would you choose? Now, I don't know about you, but when I see murder on this list, that kind of rises to the top of the pile in my mind. And so that would be my own pick personally. I mean, in my thinking, it doesn't get much worse than murder, right? So let's say, for the purposes of this illustration, let's just say that murder might be the most evil offense on this list. Now, I want you to ponder this question. Would you accept life-changing spiritual teaching and personal guidance from an ex-murderer who was a member in your church who now loved the Lord? Think about this carefully. Could you wholeheartedly accept teaching about God from someone that had been a convicted murderer? Now, many people, if they're completely honest, will admit that they would struggle hard to wholeheartedly embrace teaching from such a person in church. And even if they forgave such a person, there might still be, a few unconscious filters and guards in place that would probably screen everything that they heard coming from such a teacher, right? And, at one level, that's totally fair. I can understand why that struggle would be very real. And keep in mind that I'm still referring to Calvin Miller's quote here that we heard just a little while ago, right? That a person might be better off shooting their spouse instead of divorcing them because murderers get more mercy in most churches than divorcees do, right? But now, keeping in mind your attitude towards this ex-murderer teaching in your church, think about this. What if we removed all the parts of the Bible that were written by murderers? Where would we start? Well, okay, let's try this. First of all, we'd have to chop out anything that was written by Moses, right? He murdered an Egyptian. And then we'd probably have to chop out all the Psalms of David, since David murdered Uriah in his day as well, right? So now as our Bibles get thinning out a little bit, we'd have to, wait, it gets worse. We'd also have to chop out everything that the Apostle Paul wrote, which is almost 1/3 of our New Testament. Now, I think you're starting to get the point here. We will happily accept a Bible that was written in part by ex-murderers, and we know that murder is something that God clearly hates. But many groups will not allow divorced people to teach classes or to sing on stage or to be a missionary or to be a leader or to do anything like that. But think about it. If that same grace that transformed the Apostle Paul has transformed and healed a person who has suffered the trauma of divorce, what right do I have to assign them to a lower status spiritually or socially or in any way than the next person? Are we not all recovering from something in some very real way? So if people are living their lives humbly before God, in abiding presence, as I like to say, and if the fruit of their lives is reflecting the Father's heart in the way that they live their lives and deal with people, then what kind of heart does it take to want to put such a person in their place by judging them and suppressing them and oppressing them? And what is there about God's grace that is sometimes missed that allows us to continue in judgment and condemnation of others so easily, especially when it comes to this sensitive matter of divorce and remarriage? And yet it seems that we have no issues in seeing past the offense of some ex-murderers who helped to write the Bible. Talk about living by a double standard, wouldn't you say? And so, my friends, we are called to be a community of grace. This means that when the opportunity to judge comes up, our first reaction is to hand that thought over to the Lord and to refuse to participate in those conversations that are not, not so well salted with grace, okay? There is truly a way that the Lord can adjust our thinking so that we can live completely free of the desire to judge other people. So some people might say, well, does that mean that I can't have any opinions on, sensitive cultural and spiritual issues? Of course not. But most people that are deeply steeped in religious thinking and in the religious mindset have never learned how to hold their opinions with grace. And by holding opinions with grace, I just mean to hold our opinions with humility in an open hand, being more willing to listen and to learn than to react to what you're hearing. And it also means to leave all judgment up to God and to be committed in your hearts to loving people where they're at, just as they are. That means not putting any conditions on our love for others, right? So I share this illustration with you so that you can discern for yourself how gracious you are in your thinking in matters such as these. Do you find yourself reacting strongly and writing off a person as soon as you find out that they've been divorced? Or does your compassion for them increase in that moment? That question alone will tell you a lot about where your heart is really at. Now, one thing we all need to realize in this discussion is that we all bring assumptions to any discussion of divorce and remarriage, okay? And since we are not speaking face to face in this format, I really have no opportunity to clarify assumptions with questions and conversations in this back and forth dialogue, right? And as is usually the case in a one-way podcast like this, without clarifying assumptions, people might assume that I mean this or that, when in reality, I mean something completely different. So I will try to clarify my assumptions as I go along in this series. But for the rest of this podcast, I want to clarify 4 basic assumptions that I hold to. And I think this will help us all get a better handle on where this conversation is going. Now, feel free to disagree with my assumptions, as always, but at least give them some thought and be aware that hearing these assumptions explained to you at least once will help you to better fit together some of the pieces of the conversation that are coming in future episodes. Now, the first assumption that needs to be clarified is what we assume that we mean when we read the word divorce in the Bible, okay? Many people assume that divorce as we know it today is exactly the same as the divorce spoken of in ancient times. Now, is this assumption actually true? What if you discovered that acting on this assumption can easily lead you to wrongly apply these ancient scriptures to our more modern situations? So it seems to me that there is a need to clarify this assumption, and if we are willing to think carefully and if we are willing to examine our own assumptions on this matter, we will find ourselves much more grounded in conversations about divorce, remarriage, and things like that. And we will also find ourselves in a much better place to openly and accurately discuss some of the ancient cultural issues that surrounded divorce. And we will be aware of how our understanding of those ancient times affects how we deal with this issue in our circles today. So if we overlook this assumption, what can happen is we can just coldly apply scripture in ways that does not accurately reflect the heart of the Father. And when we come from a place of abiding presence, we are more likely to feel this disconnect when we see people being treated in ways that shows that the heart of the Father is completely missing. So in situations like that, when I've heard comments and judgments made that did not reflect the Father's heart, I've often said to myself quietly, my Father's not like that. Now, I'm no expert in Bible history, but the family dynamics in ancient times were quite different from what we know today. The vast majority of the scriptures were written in a culture that was what we would say was pretty much a man's world, okay? Males were privileged and favored, while women and girls they kind of lived at the bottom end of the human totem pole, you might say. Seems like when we read history, we find out that sons got all the inheritances, daughters got nothing. Boys were given an education in rabbinical times, while the girls were automatically disqualified. If you look at recorded biblical genealogies in the Bible, they basically followed the male pattern and the male names most of the time. And if you even look at all of the named characters in the Bible, I believe it's only 5 to 8% of the characters named are women. And so we can see that patriarchy dominated the cultural landscape of the ancient Near Eastern world. That's the biblical world. So some people have argued that this then is the quote-unquote biblical view of how life should be lived. They feel that this patriarchal system is indeed God's design because it's what we see reflected in the Bible. Now, this again would be an assumption that we bring to the Bible, and I would say it's a very flawed assumption, okay? It's important to understand that this cultural backdrop is part of the reality that these ancient Bible authors found themselves in. And so it's only natural that this patriarchal flavor that we see would be sensed in many of the stories that they tell. This is part of the cultural backdrop and not part of the inspired message that we're supposed to act upon, okay? But the fact still remains that in the vast majority of what we read in our Bibles, women and children were seen basically more or less like property, and they were under the control of men. Women had basically no say in ancient times, and their value was primarily determined by how many children they could produce, especially sons, right? So it shouldn't surprise us to learn that women had no option to initiate a divorce in ancient times, which is very different from today, okay? Only men could initiate a divorce in ancient Bible times. There is some evidence that in the Roman culture at the time of Jesus, women were actually allowed to initiate a divorce. But in the traditional Jewish culture, this doesn't seem to have been the case. And this is a key point to remember. And this is why pretty much all of the instructions in the biblical writings on divorce are aimed at men. For most of history, women have always depended on their husbands for economic and social survival. And so for a woman to divorce her husband in those days was kind of like committing economic suicide, you might say. So this was rarely, or maybe hardly ever, a practical or a sensible option in that highly controlled, patriarchal system that they found themselves in. So in a nutshell, that was the culture that these Bible writers were speaking from and writing from, okay? And sadly, I would say that there's still too much of that patriarchal residue left in some men's thinking today. And of course, as you know, there are still entire cultures in the world today where this mindset is still the norm. So even though some people argue that this attitude of men having such power over women is quote unquote biblical, I would suggest that this is much more a reflection of that ancient culture than it is of the heart of God. There is nothing in the teachings of Jesus and nothing in the writings of the original apostles that supports any notion of men owning women as property or even of men controlling women at all. Even though the New Testament is still written in a largely patriarchal culture, we see Jesus speaking into that culture with a new tone that kind of cuts open that cultural fabric, if you know what I mean. Jesus stepped on all kinds of cultural and traditional toes as he elevated women to a much more honorable and dignified place in society. And then we see Paul teaching us to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. He's talking about men and women here, men submitting to women, women submitting to men, one to another out of reverence for Christ. And in Philippians 2 verse 3, Paul teaches us this. He says, in humility, value others above yourselves. Again, that's to be the posture of men as they deal with women in their lives, just as much as when we deal with anybody else. And then we see other examples in the New Testament of women using their leadership and their teaching gifts to help others in creative ways. In my own life, I consider it a privilege to have women as well as men speaking into my life quite regularly. I just find that there's a perspective and a richness that women bring that just does our male brains a lot of good. And so I submit my thoughts and my actions to my brothers and sisters alike. So my heart in this teaching series is to really honor our sisters in the Lord and to help those who are suffering under the religious stigmas of divorce and to help them to see themselves as worthy, highly esteemed, and precious daughters of the Lord, and to encourage them to grow in their confidence in our Father, who calls them highly favored and dearly beloved. So I hope you can appreciate that in ancient times, men held all the divorce cards. And I hope that this helps to inform any assumptions that you might still be holding on to about the realities of divorce in ancient times. So I think it's very important to understand the historical and the cultural context or backdrop, if you will, that surrounds any biblical divorce discussions. You see, divorce discussions today are much more equal opportunity discussions. Men and women both have more options than they did in the ancient Near East, and they both have a voice when trying to navigate impossible relationship issues. And although the systems that are in place these days are, they're still human and they're still imperfect and in some cases broken, there are still more resources and more safeguards in place to protect the vulnerable than ever before. And in our own work with single moms, my wife and I have been thankful to be able to use some of these resources to help bring safety and healing to broken hearts and to broken single moms. And God has been faithful to make a way in some really creative and amazing ways. So as we move along in this series, I just want us to pay careful attention to how Jesus responded to his ancient culture before we make all kinds of applications to our more modern situations. And much of this hinges on our assumptions about the meaning and the context of this one little word, divorce. You'll hear more on this later in part 3. A second assumption that I hold to is that marriage is a holy covenant instituted by God, and it needs to be honored and protected the best way that we can, but not necessarily at all costs. Let me explain that in a little bit more detail. I think that guarding our marriages and growing our marriage relationships is to be a high priority in our lives. And I think that us men are supposed to take our call to love our wives like Christ loved the church very seriously. And I also think that where both spouses are believers in Christ, each spouse needs to be aware of their own responsibility in cultivating their relationship with the Lord in a way that is meaningful for them. I also think that each spouse should desire to grow in their ability to communicate and to resolve conflict with each other in healthy and productive ways. And also, I think there needs to be fun scattered throughout this relationship. Marriage is supposed to be fun. You're supposed to enjoy doing life with your spouse. And having the Lord at the center of your marriage means that your marriage relationship will reflect the love, the peace, and the unity that exists between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. I could go on and on here, but let's remember that this is not a series on how to grow a great marriage, even though this is a very important practice and something that I like to keep uppermost in my mind. What we're talking about in this series is the reality of divorce here and how we can develop a spirit-informed response to divorce, especially if it becomes a reality closer to home than we would like. So my assumption is that marriage is a holy covenant ordained by God, and we are to guard it, but not necessarily at all costs, okay? Because you see, some Christians think that all marriages are automatically sacred and that sustaining that institution of marriage is always God's highest priority, regardless of the brokenness and the hurt that's happening in that relationship. Now, I think that this thinking reflects a false assumption about the priorities of God. I mean, God is definitely glorified when our marriages are a reflection of unity and grace and peace. But the truth of the matter is that some marriages are diabolical and sick, and they are filled with evil and toxicity. And, I think it's pretty safe to say that no marriage wants to start out that way, right? I mean, think about it. Aren't most weddings filled with love and dreams and hope and excitement? And wouldn't you say that most newlyweds are planning for their relationship to last forever? I would sure think so. That's what I've seen. But as life goes on, the need to guard our marriages and to cultivate that relationship becomes more and more clear. And I think it's a fact of life that in some relationships, one spouse may become distracted or disengaged, and maybe in some more extreme cases, one spouse may become controlling, selfish, and even abusive. Now, these changes sometimes, or often I should say, come slowly, and it may happen to either one of the spouses or sometimes to both at the same time, this hardening of the heart. And so as hearts begin to crust over and get harder and harder, the feelings within the relationship change, and there are different warning signs that begin to appear in the relationship. The relationship does not reflect the glory of God, and the marriage does not accurately portray the relationship that Christ has with his people, which is really what Ephesians tells us that marriage is designed to reflect, right? Now, this is not to say that people who are in that tough situation can't find help and healing and turn the ship around, right? That would be the wise thing to do for sure, and some couples certainly do that. But many others become lost in their brokenness and they somehow just can't seem to find their way back out. And so when selfishness rules and when abusive behavior takes over in a marriage and when hearts are hard and there's no cooperation in seeking help together, there really is no honor in denying the truth and forcing something that is dead to pretend that it is still alive, okay? That would be like what happens in that old movie, Weekend at Bernie's. If you've ever seen that movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So what I'm saying here is that if the degree of toxicity is hurting the relationship, There is nothing noble about hiding behind a false sense of sacredness while someone in the relationship is dying behind these false pretenses. That's what I'm saying. So although I assume that marriage is sacred, I believe that people are always more sacred to the Lord than the marriage itself. And I think this would be especially true when we're talking about destructive marriages. For people stuck in abusive and oppressive relationships, when they have tried to seek help for their situation, or when, one spouse only hardens their heart more and more, there sometimes needs to be a physical separation in order to give someone some breathing room. Now, this doesn't automatically clear up all of the hurt and the confusion and, the many other swirling emotions that are going on inside, but at least they can be safe and they can start to sort out their thoughts and their feelings with this in a safe place, right? And, the heart of the Father, as I understand it, would say that hurting people need to be cared for, protected, and loved, and not sacrificed on the altar of an ideal institution, even if that institution is marriage. All teachings that claim to be biblical, including those about divorce, they need to be applied with both wisdom and compassion, and they need to convey the heart of God. So even though God really does not like the damage and the pain that divorce causes his cherished kids, he loves and he cares for divorced people, okay? And I believe that his love for divorced people is even greater than his love for the institution of marriage that he himself has established. So maybe examine your own assumptions in this whole area about what you think God values more: loving his children who are hurting, or enforcing the rules as they pertain to an ideal institution. This third assumption that I want us to examine will quickly become clear to you as you process this simple question: is divorce a sin? I've heard discussions that sometimes use the phrase, the sin of divorce, but what kind of assumption is this phrase based on? If divorce itself is truly a sin, well, then all the single moms that we've helped on this journey would now be left with a sinful cloud hanging over their heads that still needs to be dealt with. However, in the cases that we have dealt with so far, none of these moms were responsible for the situation that they found themselves in. Their husbands all bailed out of the relationship in different ways, and there was nothing sinful about these women walking out this difficult journey through separation and divorce. We need to remember that sin always flows out of the hardness of people's hearts. And Jesus taught the religious teachers in Matthew chapter 19 that Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of people's hearts. So it seems to me that according to Jesus, that the hardness of heart is a significant factor behind most divorce stories, if not all of them. And this hardness can express itself in many different ways. Some expressions of hardness might be, more outwardly toxic and abusive, and other ones might be a little more, passive aggressive. You know what I'm saying? Either way, it's the attitudes and the actions that flow from a hard heart that are sinful. The many little sins and offenses that lead up to the divorce, those are the sins that accumulate and compound to the point where the relationship becomes impossible. And the one who breaks the covenant of marriage through their own hardness of heart will suffer the effects of their own hardness, because that's just how sin works, right? The wages of sin is always death. And it doesn't really help to figure out whose heart is harder than the other person's or who's more to blame for this messed up relationship. All sin is forgivable before or after a divorce. And those who humble themselves and seek the Lord in their brokenness will always find a soft landing spot in His presence, and their souls will be restored. So back to our original question, is divorce a sin? Well, I guess on the one hand, you could say that if I were to act spitefully and cruelly toward my wife, and if I were to demand a divorce without any attempt at working out our differences, I would be sinning against my wife. But in general, my assumption is that divorce as a process is not, in fact, a sin, okay? If you see two people who are divorced, it is not automatically assumed, in my mind, that they are living in sin. Signing a divorce paper or initiating the divorce process is not the sin. But as long as we see it as a sin, we will completely lose sight of the hurting people that are involved, and we will fixate on the sinfulness of a legal process and completely miss the opportunity to speak life and grace into hurting lives where it's needed the most. And as sad as it is, there are situations where divorce is actually the kindest thing that can happen to set a hurting person free. In fact, sometimes the perpetrator, or the one who has broken the covenant of marriage, will actually refuse to divorce because divorcing means that they will lose control over the other spouse. And in other cases, the controlling spouse will make life so miserable for the other person so that that second person will finally break down and file for divorce out of desperation, which the controlling spouse will then use against them as yet another accusation. Stuff like, hey, I'm not the one who filed for divorce, you filed for divorce, right? Making the person feel more, just piling on the shame and blaming them for this so-called sin that they have committed against the marriage. And as you can imagine, if the belief is that all divorce is sinful and that it makes God angry and things like that, well, this leaves one spouse trapped as a victim in a no-win situation. Can you see how that works? And if this person is convinced that leaving the relationship or contemplating divorce is a sin, their false assumptions might keep them trapped in that toxic situation forever. They might even think that their decision to stay in an abusive relationship in some weird way pleases the Lord, since they have this high commitment or this deep commitment to their marriage, even though it is completely dangerous and toxic. Now, I've seen these scenarios and I have heard this toxic abuse in real life. So I just want to help us all to think clearly and to think very deeply about this issue. If we really want to talk about sin as it pertains to divorce, let's at least focus on all the stuff that led to the courthouse, okay? Making the final divorce the one big sin is to misunderstand the bigger issue and to create unending judgment where there needs to be compassion. We need compassion, we need grace, we need practical support for those who are hurting and who need someone to walk alongside of them in situations where there may be nobody else willing to lend a hand and to be a support. So yes, divorce is a last resort, but when the other efforts at reconciliation are not fruitful, sometimes divorce is still the best choice. And I believe that the Lord is on the side of safety and emotional and mental well-being, even if it is found by ending a bad marriage. So what if we think about divorce the way we think of a funeral, okay? So a funeral is not a death, right? Neither is a funeral a sin. A funeral is simply a ceremony where we acknowledge that a death has happened and where we gather to support the family and loved ones as they experience a closure of this season in their lives. So what if we thought about divorce in the same way? What would happen then? Divorce is also an official proclamation of what has been true of the relationship for quite a while. It's dead. And this death, quote unquote, happened in 100 little ways over the course of many months and probably even over many years. So I'm going to ask you again, is divorce a sin? And will your answer to this question affect the way that you navigate any future conversations about divorce? And the last assumption that I want to highlight as we end part 2 here concerns the very nature of God himself. Now, I assume that God is working redemptively in all kinds of brokenness, even when we can't see what he's up to. And the expression of the Lord's redemptive work, or the degree of healing that we experience, will depend on our willingness to allow him to lead us down that redemptive pathway back up to higher ground. Now, what might your assumptions be as you think about how you've typically responded to messy divorce situations between believers where one or both spouses have lost their way? Have you assumed that God is working in messy relationships to heal and to restore broken hearts? Or do you see him there kind of as a judge, trying to, working to shame people for not trying harder or for not sticking to the rules of marriage or something like that? When God looks at someone who is trapped in a hopeless marriage, is he looking upon such a person with judgment, Or is his heart filled with compassion and grace for what they are enduring? And the older I get, the more convinced I am that my view of God continually needs to be informed by my time spent in the presence of God, where I allow the example and the teachings and the compassion of Jesus to shape my thinking and my feelings, and to change my default response from one of judgment to one of redemptive compassion. And so my assumption in this regard is that God is always working redemptively in broken humanity to bring about beauty from ashes, to change our tears of sadness into rivers of joy, and to bring about a glorious resurrection when, humanly speaking, all we can see is death. Our calling and our privilege is to bring the Lord's redemptive presence to every broken situation and to bring some gray salt, you might say, to these difficult conversations. So, does this redemptive presence overshadow you? This reminds me of something a wise preacher once said when he said, "Your shadow will reflect whatever overshadows you." And can you name what it is that is overshadowing you? So if my heart has not been softened, and if I do not reflect the Lord's redemptive presence as I mingle with people in my life, I will probably have very little to offer the broken people that come across my path. Just me quoting a long list of Bible verses, that just won't cut it. Without the salt shaker of grace, all that's left for me to pass on really is judgment. And there's nothing redemptive that can ever happen when I dish out judgment and condemnation. Because condemnation does nothing to motivate people towards change or towards the Lord, even though much religious teaching might lead us to think that this is actually the case. The truth of the matter is that your time spent in abiding presence will eventually provide you with a redemptive response that will land well when you are walking alongside someone who is hurting as their marriage is flying apart. And if you are the one enduring the trauma of divorce, the Lord will resurrect hope within you and will eventually turn the ashes of your situation into something beautiful as well. Even in the messiness of divorce, let's assume that Jesus wants to work redemptively to bring hope and healing to those who will trust Him to work that all out in their lives. As we close, I'd like to leave you with a powerful quote that I came across a few years ago that I've never forgotten. And here it is. If you don't have a redemptive answer to the broken human condition, you have no answer at all. I pray that we will examine our assumptions in these areas very carefully and that our hearts will be prepared to continue this conversation in part 3. See you there.